Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 13th of December, where we are, believe it or not, in our final week of the semester. So just to review some due dates, paper number 2 would have been due on the 8th, but I will take it up until the 15th. Please send that to me via PDF to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And do note that while I've tried to be flexible with due dates, I have my own due dates that I need to meet. Therefore, the 15th is our last day of class and the last day in which you can submit in assignments. And that also includes your journal number 3, which is going to be very similar to what you did with journal 2 and journal 1. This time I'm asking you to choose 3 poems, since we're in the poetry unit, and respond to each of those poems in about a page or so, and to send that to me, to my email, and I will respond to that informally, grade it on a checkmark system, and return that back to you before your final examination, which happens to be on Thursday the 22nd at 1 p.m. That would have been the time in which we would have had our final if we were meeting in person. So what I will do is post the final at that point. You'll have 24 hours to complete that final. It will be mostly based on poetry, 80 points worth, but there will also be a brief 10-point question on short story and a brief 10-point question on drama, just to basically put some closure onto the semester as a whole. And where we are with poetry is talking about 4 poems, the first being American Poetry by Louis Simpson. And my suspicion is that this is probably a poem you haven't heard of before, nor this is a poem that you have probably studied before, but I wanted to put this poem in our selection of poems at this point in the semester because we will be seeing transition. And what we've seen thus far is some pretty contemporary or some pretty traditional poetry, and mostly from Britain, though we have transitioned into America with poets such as Emily Dickinson. But you will see a shift, and as the poems become more contemporary, they will be basically breaking many of the established conventions that we've seen thus far, even with the small number of poems that we've read. And also, I think that shift is in part because of time period as we enter into the 1900s, and in part because of culture as we shift from going from mostly British poetry to mostly American poetry, which is what this poem is about, American Poetry by Louis Simpson. And I went out of the chronology for this particular poem, deliberately so, just to illustrate that what we are going to be talking about following this poem, I think very much illustrates many of the elements that he was referencing in American poetry. So he wrote this in 1963, but we'll be going backward to the early 1900s after that. And the poem reads, "Whatever it is, it must have a stomach that can digest rubber, coal, uranium, moons, poems. Like the shark, it contains a shoe. It must swim for miles through the desert, uttering cries that are almost human." And of course, we've talked about the idea of reading a poem multiple times. The first just to get a sense of its sound, the second to try to paraphrase it in our own language, and the third to interpret it. Now, this is not an easy poem to interpret. Right from the very beginning, it says, "Whatever it is." The "it" is a pronoun, and we talked a little bit about this with Shakespeare, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" in his sonnet, when he ends his sonnet basically saying, "As long as men can breathe and eyes can see, as long lives this, and this gives life to thee." And this is the pronoun that's replacing the noun poem or sonnet. And once we add in that noun or that clarifying word, then the poem becomes much clearer to us that what Shakespeare is arguing is that poetry can immortalize through verse. Hence, the poet can immortalize through verse. And this, if you were to engage in something similar using a pronoun but without making it clear what noun it was replacing would be called an unclear pronoun reference, which I might have made a comment about in some of your previous writing. We see something similar here with America, or with this particular poem, American Poetry, that whatever it is, and the it, that unclear pronoun reference, is replacing the noun and the title. Whatever American poetry is, and now things become much clearer. Whatever American poetry is, it must have a stomach that can digest. And already the tone is somewhat negative here, this idea of consumption. And of course, you could say that that's very American, the idea of excessive consumption. That can digest rubber, coal, uranium, moons, and poems. Quite the list. You think about all of these words are associated with industry on some level. Certainly rubber, coal, uranium, and moons. Poems, if you want to talk about the reading and writing of literature as another kind of industry, suppose that would work. Definitely the idea of rubber, coal, and uranium. I think about Walter Lee Younger and A Raisin in the Sun, talking about when you're going to be a man and run a rubber plant. Coal being an energy source, a dirty energy source, as I'm sure we all know, and uranium being used for nuclear weapons, which has led to the possibility of the destruction of our planet and everything on it. And all of these are associated with America. Moon. And if you think about the time in which this particular poem was written, the moon race, and this idea of being able to usurp the Russians. Moon and poems also have very romantic and lyric elements associated with them. So I think that that's a nice pairing with the two. But the idea that rubber, coal, uranium, and moon all share similarities with poems, especially American poetry. Because American poetry should have a stomach that can digest all of these things. In other words, talk about anything and everything. It doesn't necessarily have to follow a particular criteria the way that a sonnet does. It doesn't necessarily have to rhyme the way that we've seen many of our poems do in the past. It doesn't necessarily even have to make sense. And like the shark, and again, there's this idea of consumption again, because that's what sharks do. They're predatory. Like the shark, it contains a shoe. And we can wonder why it is that the shark contains a shoe. Perhaps it's consumed an individual. Sharks are also known for eating anything, including garbage. It must swim for miles through the desert. And of course, that's impossible. It's an oxymoron. You can't swim through the desert. And imagine trying to do such a thing. You know, the contradiction and the paradox of trying to swim in sand. And the futileness of it all. Uttering cries that are almost human. And again, that very negative tone. And I think that this poem really sets the stage for some of the more experimental poetry we are going to be reading. Now, the next poem that I had assigned for us to discuss, The Road Not Taken, isn't necessarily one of these poems. It is a very classic poem written in 1916 by Robert Frost. And you probably are familiar with this particular poem because it's become a part of pop culture. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. But I can tell you that this poem is very commonly misread, just like Shakespeare's sonnet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day is very commonly misread. Shakespeare's sonnet is misread because oftentimes individuals will say that it is a romantic sonnet that's written to a woman. There are no pronouns in that poem that would seem to indicate that it would be written to a woman. We've got thee and thou, which means you, but there is no gender association with that. And if scholars are correct in the way that they have grouped these sonnets, that sonnet was part of the early set of sonnets written to a young man, probably the Earl of Southampton or someone similar who would have been Shakespeare's patron. And when we read the poem carefully, it's more a poem of flattery than it is about romance. So certainly while individuals can say that this poem can be used for romantic situations, it need not be exclusively for romantic situations, which I think is part of the power. So again, that poem is misread usually because people will say that it was written to a woman, and according to scholars, that's the exact opposite. It was written to Shakespeare's patron, more as an element of flattery rather than there having any kind of sexual undertones. This poem, The Road Not Taken, is also commonly misread. And one of the reasons why this poem is so frequently misread is because individuals will read the poem and not consider the title. And this is something that we've talked about at the very beginning of the semester, that we need to think about the importance of the title, because the title will oftentimes give us a sense as to how we should understand a particular work. And this poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken, 1916. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, just as fair, and having, perhaps, the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though, as for that the passing there, had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And if we were to go through all of these stanzas, what we would see, two roads could be symbolic or representational of two choices. And they diverged in a yellow wood, and we can talk about all of the possibilities of why these woods might be yellow. It could be, if you are a New Englander, and Frost was, and we are as well, that this is the time of autumn. And you know the incredible lush landscape in autumn when the leaves are changing, since this is oftentimes read as a poem of change as well as a poem of choice. However, there are other ways that we can think of yellow as well. We could think of yellow in association with sunlight. We can also think of yellow in terms of how it's oftentimes used to denote cowardice. But we know that the woods, since we've seen this with young Goodman Brown, is a place where oftentimes things are untamed and wild and choice needs to be made. Sorry I could not travel both, that this is a very common experience of humanity to have two choices and wishing that you can have both, but you can't. One choice precludes another. And I was longing to stand and look down as far as I could to where the road bent in the undergrowth. And you're trying to look as far as you can ahead for your choice to see where it will lead, but there's only so far you can see. Just like these two metaphorical roads where you want to be one traveler and travel both, and you can't, so you're looking at down one as far as you can to see where it leads. And then our next stanza, then took the other just as fair. So now you look at the other road, which seems to be just as fair, fair being beautiful in this instance, and having perhaps the better claim. Notice the qualification of perhaps. Maybe one is better than another because it was grassy and wanted wear. It might be better because it seems like it's less traveled. Though, as for that their passing there, had worn them really about the same. However, the more you contemplate these two roads, it seems like they've both been traveled equally. And we could say the same with the choices. If you're going back and forth with the choice, it could be something inconsequential, like what to have for dinner, or it could be something much more significant, where to go to college or whom to marry. And regardless, the idea is that it seems at one moment that one choice is better than another, but then upon reflection, it seems the other one is better. And then upon further reflection, maybe they're both equal. And then the third stanza says, and both that morning equally lay. At that moment in time, both choices or both roads seem equal. That in leaves no step had trodden black. So there wasn't one road that was more worn than another. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubt if I should ever come back. That I would like to be able to think that I can make one choice or take one road and then come back and take the other road or make the other choice. But of course, one choice leads to another, leads to another. It's a domino effect. So it's just about impossible to get back to the original point in time with the original two choices. are the original two roads. And I, and the emphasis is on him and as an individual, not necessarily us as humanity as a whole. I shall be telling this with a sigh. There are lots of reasons why people sigh. We can sigh with happiness and contentment, but we can also sigh with sadness and disappointment. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. The assumption is that in the future, this choice was important enough to be talking about it throughout the ages. Two roads diverge in a wood, and I. So the emphasis is on the individual. This might not be right for all of us, but it was right for this person. I took the one less traveled by. But again, remember that there was uncertainty as to whether or not one was indeed less traveled by or not. And that has made all the difference. People usually read that as a positive, though we're never told if that's made all the difference is a good thing or a bad thing. But what's more important is the title. The title is about the road not taken, or the choice not taken, not the choice taken. That this poem is more about the regret and the longing that occurs whenever you make a choice, and just the curiosity of what if. What if you had made the other choice? What could have happened? One of the reasons why I signed this particular poem is because there is an explication or a detailed analysis of it immediately following. This is on page, I believe, 872 of the text, the edition that I ordered. And it says that the road not taken intrigues readers because it's at once so simple and so deeply resonant. Recalling a walk in the woods, the speaker describes how he came to a fork in the road, which forced him to choose one path over another. Though sorry that he could not travel both, he made a choice after carefully weighing his two options. This essentially is what happens in the poem. There's no other action. However, the incident is charged with symbolic significance by the speaker's reflections on the necessity and consequences of his decision. The final stanza indicates that the choice concerns more than simply walking down a road, but the speaker says that choosing the, quote, less traveled, unquote, path has affected his entire life and, quote, that's made all the difference, unquote. Frost draws on a familiar enough metaphor when he compares life to a journey, but he's also calling attention to a less commonly noted problem. Despite our expectations, aspirations, appetites, hopes, desires, we cannot have it all. Making one choice precludes another. It's impossible to determine what particular decision the speaker refers to. Perhaps he had to choose a college or a career or a spouse. Perhaps he was confronted with mutually exclusive ideas, beliefs, or values. There's no way to know because Frost wisely creates a symbolic choice, implicitly invites us to supply our own circumstances. The speaker's reflections about his choice are essential to an understanding of the poem as the choice itself. Indeed, it may be more central. He describes the road taken as, quote, having perhaps the better claim, / because it was grassy and wanted wear, unquote. He prefers the, quote, less traveled path, unquote. This seems to be an expression of individualism, which could account for the difference his choice made in his life. But Frost complicates matters by having the speaker also acknowledge that there are no significant differences between the two roads. One was, quote, just as fair, unquote, as the other, and each was, quote, worn really about the same, unquote. And, quote, both that morning equally lay, / in leaves no step had trodden black, unquote. The speaker imagines that in the future, quote, ages and ages hence, unquote, he will recount his choice with a sigh that will satisfactorily explain the course of his life. But Frost seems to be having a little fun here by showing us how the speaker will embellish his past decision to make it appear more dramatic. What we hear is someone trying to convince himself that the choice he made significantly changed his life. When he recalls what happened in the, quote, yellow wood, unquote, a color that gives a glow to that irretrievable moment when his life seemed to be on the verge of a momentous change, he appears more concerned with the path he did not choose than with the one he did. Frost shrewdly titles the poem to suggest the speaker's sense of loss and not being able to travel both roads. When the speaker's reflections about his choice are examined, the poem reveals his nostalgia instead of affirming his decision to travel a self-reliant path in life. The rhyme stanzas of The Road Not Taken follow a pattern established in the first 5 lines, A, B, A, B. This rhyme scheme reflects perhaps the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. The natural speech rhythms Frost uses allow him to integrate the rhymes unobtrusively, but there's a slight shift in lines 19 and 20, when the speaker asserts self-consciously that the, quote, less traveled, unquote, road, which we already know to be basically the same as the other road, quote, made all the difference, unquote. Unlike all the other rhymes in the poem, difference does not rhyme precisely with hence. The emphasis must be placed on the ence to make it rhyme perfectly with hence, which may suggest that the speaker is trying just a little too hard to pattern his life on his earlier choice, in the woods. Perhaps the best way to begin reading Frost's poetry is to accept the invitation he placed at the beginning of many volumes of his poems. The pasture means what it says, of course. It's about taking care of some farm chores. But it's also a means of saying one thing in terms of another. And this explication obviously is much more detailed and much more developed than anything that you could write during a final exam. This would be something that would be much more comparable to writing a paper if you were writing a paper about poetry. But notice that it has an introductory paragraph. It's got body paragraphs with evidence, details, with use of quotation. And whenever I referenced a slash in the quote, the slash is used to indicate that that's the ending of one line of poetry. And then after the slash, this is the beginning of the new line of poetry. And we have a concluding paragraph. So I just wanted you to see that as an example of how to go about reading the poem. And again, that this is less about a poem about being an individual and more a poem about the sense of regret, or at least wonder and curiosity about the choice not made. Look at the title. Just like with American poetry, whatever it is in reference to the title, American poetry. Now, one poem that does perhaps illustrate what American poetry was discussing is Next to, of course, God by E.E. Cummings. If you've heard of E.E. Cummings before, you know he's part of those authors that are considered part of the literary canon, those works considered by scholars and critics to be worth academic study. And E.E. Cummings is known for breaking conventions, not only in terms of his subject matter, but also in terms of his writing style. And you'll notice this in terms of his lack of capitalization, for instance. And his poem, Next to, of course, God, America, I, is somewhat unusual because the setting of the poem, there is a setting to this poem, establishes how it breaks conventions, because it's a poem that is given in the context of someone delivering a speech, and what they are doing is they're talking about patriotism. Keep in mind that this poem was written in 1926, so the assumption is that patriotism is going to be presented in a very positive and in a very in some ways a very rich way for America and the media to sort of think about patriotism as an all-good element. Now, we know that certainly there have been questions about what is patriotism over time, but you wouldn't expect to hear that in 1926, and you wouldn't expect to hear that in the context of a public speech. Again, think about if you were even today listening to something like a presidential address, you assume that what you are going to be hearing is more positive rather than negative about the United States. So this poem breaks both of those conventions, as well as ultimately utilizing some of the non-standard writing forms, such as irregular punctuation or irregular capitalization. Next to, of course, God, America, I, by E.E. Cummings, 1926. Notice it begins with a quotation mark. So this is what someone is saying. Next to, of course, God, America, I love you, land of the pilgrims and so forth. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early, my country 'tis of countries, my country 'tis of centuries come and go, and are no more, what of it? We should worry in every language, even deaf and dumb. Thy sons acclaim your glorious name by gory, by jingle, by gee, by gosh, by gum. Why talk of beauty? What could be more beautiful? than these heroic happy dead, who rushed like lions to the roaring slaughter. They did not stop to think, they died instead. Then shall the voice of liberty be mute? And now we have a closed quotation. All of this was a quote. It's one long question. And then we've got a space. He spoke, period, and drank rapidly a glass of water. Again, the idea if that someone is speaking and also drinking a glass of water, it's probably a public address. And what this person is doing is giving us a list of cliches, basically, about what is supposed to be viewed as patriotic in order to question standard patriotism. So we've got fragments of things like the Pledge of Allegiance or patriotic songs. Next to, of course, God, America, I love you, Land of the Pilgrims, and so forth and so on. In other words, there's a dismissal there, which could be seen as quite disrespectful. You see by the dawn's early, again, just fragments of elements that are usually associated with patriotic activities. Can you see by the dawn's early, my country 'tis of centuries come and go and are no more, what of it? We should worry in every language, even deaf and dumb. Deaf and dumb are basically run together so that it draws your attention to deaf and dumb. The assumption is that the deaf and dumb are the citizens of America, specifically those who fight wars, as we continue on. Thy sons acclaim your glorious name. Thy sons being soldiers. Again, think of the time period, 1926. So men would be in the military. Thy sons acclaim your glorious name, talking about America. By gory, by jingle, by gee, by gosh, by gum. Notice all those good sounds, alliteration, the initial repetition of consonant sounds. It could also sound like a gun being fired. That's also another G word as well. And yes, war is gory. Jingo, if you're familiar with jingoism, the idea of putting one's culture or one's society above others. And G and gosh and gum, those are supposed to be the words used by Americans. We would never use profanity, for instance. We'd say gosh. So of course, G, that's not necessarily the case, certainly not in the context of war. Why talk of beauty? What could be more beautiful? And the one word in the poem that's about beautiful is actually divided up into two pieces. It's contractions. Beaut is part, and then beautiful. Then these heroic, happy, dead. And again, notice the alliteration for heroic and happy. Who rush like lions to the roaring slaughter, saying that this is what soldiers do. They rush like lions to the roaring slaughter, and they don't stop to think. They just do what they're told by their country without contemplating the consequences. They died instead, and the result was that they died. Notice that when I'm putting the pauses in the right places, even though there isn't punctuation there, it becomes much easier to read. Then shall the voice of liberty be mute. And the idea of what is the voice of liberty and what is patriotism? Is patriotism blindly serving your country? Or is patriotism questioning your country, which is what this author is doing? And think about how controversial this poem would be today in 2022, let alone in 1926. So again, what we have is E.E. Cummings questioning what it means to be patriotic, suggesting that the patriotism that oftentimes is promoted by government and media, such as being able to sing a national anthem or say a Pledge of Allegiance, is really meaningless. And in fact, people don't necessarily even know all the words. And even if they did, it doesn't match anything like taking the action of going to war. And even that is oftentimes filled with hollowness because these soldiers are blindly following orders and not necessarily orders that are in any way patriotic or justified or honorable. And they pay for it with their lives because they're taught not to question. So again, this is a pretty heavy subject matter for today, certainly for 1926. So you can see how E.E. Cummings is really, through this public address, questioning many of the expectations of his time. And the lack of capitalization works so nicely in this particular poem because we usually capitalize proper nouns in order to show them respect. Things like names, for instance, or the pronoun I, or God. And you can see here that God is in a lowercase, America is in a lowercase, I is in a lowercase. And the idea is that none of these deserve to have honor or respect, or at least not the level of honor or respect that we would give them. But I can't think of any author who defies convention more, perhaps, than Allen Ginsberg. And that's how I wanted to end today with Allen Ginsberg. He wrote in 1956 a poem called America. So you can see that both this poem that I was doing with E.E. Cummings, next to, of course, God, America, I, and also the idea of America are about the same subject matter, America. Though think about the way that E.E. Cummings formed his first sentence, that next to, of course, God, America, I, that perhaps God, America, and I are all equal in this, again, the way that the sentence is formed without the punctuation. But the Beat Poets, they had a style of writing. They mostly came from California, and they were writing in the 1950s. And they were writing in a stream of consciousness. They were trying to duplicate, basically, the thought process that would go on in our heads. So it didn't necessarily have the rhyme and the meter and the structure that we've become accustomed to with poetry. In fact, it was oftentimes the antithesis of that. And oftentimes it would even break apart. It wasn't always supposed to make sense because our thoughts don't always make sense. And their subject matter, like America, doesn't always make sense either. And this defiant and unconventional stream of consciousness poetry that was deliberately unclear had many topical references to it, which makes reading the poem perhaps somewhat challenging for readers in our time period because he's talking about very specific events from the 1950s. So if you can find a version of the poem that's got some good footnotes, basically he's talking about events in the news that oftentimes, from his perspective, show the injustices occurring in America. Think about how late night talk show hosts do that in our contemporary time and how quickly that becomes dated, that we easily forget after a few months, even weeks, sometimes days, these specific events. So you can imagine looking back at them 30 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever the case may happen to be. Now, in terms of this particular poem, I have an audio recording of Allen Ginsberg reading his poem to an audience. And I think that listening to his reading is the best way to end this particular section on poetry for today. And the next class, we can talk about the analysis of the poem itself. It's a rather long poem, as you'll see. And he was reading to an audience at Berkeley. And that was really the center of where the Beat movement began. And his audience, as you can see, or hear, I should say, when he reads the poem, were very engaged. So I wanted you to hear as much the audience response as much as Allen Ginsberg's reading. Now, the reading of his poem will be different than the text of the final poem that you will find printed in, let's say, poetry anthologies or in the link that I provided you with, because this poem was still under construction when he was reading it to his Berkeley audience. So you'll be able to see, or I should say hear, some of the changes that he made from when he first presented it as a draft, in effect, to his live audience and when he finally published it. And that's also interesting about a poem or any piece of literature, is to see the stages it's gone through and the edits and the changes that have been made to it. But as you can see, this is a good 10-minute poem. So what I'm going to do is to ask you to listen to the poem. You can see in the notes below in the fourth section on America, I've included the text for the Poetry Foundation website for where you can find the poem America, though you could find the poem America and lots of other websites as well. But you'll note that many of the poems that we're doing, I'm directing you to the Poetry Foundation. It's a great website for being able to find poetry, though it certainly isn't the only one. and also a YouTube video, again, of Allen Ginsberg, his audio of reading America to his audience and the audience response to that. So what that leaves us with is an attendance question, so that next class we can talk about Allen Ginsberg's America. We can talk about The Lover Not Taken by Farley, a poem called Coca-Cola and Coco Frio by Martina Spada, and then our final poem, which happens to be The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman. So that's how we will finish up the semester next class. So for our attendance question, I thought I would ask you that based on the 4 poems today, American Poetry, The Road Not Taken, next to, of course, God, America, I, or America, even though we haven't had much of a chance to talk about America, which of these 4 poems do you think is most relevant to our current time and society, and why? And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses. And I've fallen a little bit behind with my responding to your responses, but I will be catching up soon. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and enjoy listening to Allen Ginsberg. Take care. Bye-bye.